Australia's energy system is both resource-rich and rapidly evolving, shaped by vast indigenous reserves of coal and gas, world-leading uptake of distributed solar, ambitious national decarbonization targets, and the practical realities of a sprawling grid that connects distant population centers to remote energy resources. Understanding Australia's primary energy sources means holding several truths at once. The country is a heavyweight exporter of fossil fuels, even as it accelerates renewable electricity at home. It is a global uranium powerhouse that does not generate power from nuclear, and it is simultaneously an energy super-exporter and a net importer of transport fuels. Each of these threads weaves into a complex policy tapestry that defines how Australians produce, move, and use energy today, and how they plan to do so tomorrow. Coal remains foundational to Australia's energy economy, though its role is diverging between export markets and domestic power generation. Australia's coal resources are world-class in both volume and quality, and coal provides a substantial share of export earnings, with the majority of production shipped overseas rather than consumed at home. Government energy fact sheets indicate that roughly two-thirds of Australia's total energy output is exported, including about 85% of coal and 74% of gas, figures that underscore how central international demand is to the sector. Domestically, however, coal-fired generation is steadily ceding ground to solar, wind, and storage as aging plants approach retirement and the economics of renewables improve. This decoupling, where coal remains lucrative as an export but declines in the national power mix, has become a defining feature of Australia's transition. Natural gas plays two distinct roles in the Australian energy story. It is a dispatchable fuel that can support electricity reliability during periods of low wind and solar output, and it is the feedstock for Australia's large liquefied natural gas (LNG) export industry. On the export side, Australia is consistently among the world's top LNG suppliers, with volumes near 80 million tons per year in recent periods, according to state and federal sources. LNG production hubs in Western Australia and the Northern Territory ship cargoes across the Indo-Pacific, and export receipts have at times rivaled iron ore for national income. Yet this success has not insulated the domestic market from tight supply, particularly on the East Coast, where legacy offshore fields are declining, and infrastructure constraints complicate moving gas to where it is needed most. Policymakers have therefore pursued seasonal supply agreements and market interventions to avert winter shortfalls while seeking a longer-term balance between export commitments and domestic reliability. Oil and refined fuels tell a different story again. Australia produces some crude oil and condensate offshore, but domestic production has fallen over time, and the nation now imports the majority of its oil requirements while exporting much of what it produces due to refinery configurations and market economics. With only 2 operating refineries remaining, Geelong in Victoria and Lytton in Queensland, Australia relies heavily on imports of refined products such as petrol, diesel, and jet fuel. That reliance has prompted an ongoing national conversation about fuel security, strategic reserves, and the resilience of supply chains in the face of geopolitical risk, with periodic government measures aimed at bolstering storage and underwriting domestic refining capability. If fossil fuels dominate Australia's export identity, renewables increasingly define its domestic electricity transition. Australia's uptake of rooftop solar is unmatched on a per capita basis, with millions of households and businesses installing systems that collectively behave like a giant distributed power station. On sunny days, rooftop generation can meet a substantial share of daytime demand in parts of the National Electricity Market, NEM, displacing coal and gas and pushing wholesale prices downward, especially when paired with rapidly growing battery storage. Utility-scale solar and wind are expanding as well, albeit with growing pains related to transmission congestion, connection queues, and supply chain volatility. Even with these challenges, federal energy statistics show renewables supplying a rising share of electricity, approaching and in some quarters, surpassing 2/5 of generation across the NEM, with records repeatedly broken for instantaneous renewable penetration. Hydropower, while a smaller fraction of total generation than in some other countries, occupies a critical strategic role as a flexible, dispatchable renewable. The Snowy Hydro scheme in southeastern Australia is the historical backbone of this capability, and the Snowy 2.0 pumped hydro expansion, though beset by delays and cost pressures, has been conceived as an enormous storage project to help firm variable wind and solar output for decades to come. When complete, it will move water between reservoirs to store surplus electricity and release it during peaks, effectively turning intermittent generation into dependable capacity. The project's difficulties have spotlighted the broader infrastructure challenge of decarbonizing a sprawling grid. Big projects take time, cost money, and must navigate technical and environmental hurdles even when their long-term value to system resilience is clear. Wind power has become the workhorse of renewable energy growth alongside solar, with strong resources concentrated in coastal and elevated regions. Onshore wind accounts for most installed capacity today, while offshore wind is the next frontier. The federal government has declared or proposed offshore wind zones off Gippsland in Victoria and the Hunter and Illawarra coasts in New South Wales, among others, initiating environmental assessments and commercial processes that could see large projects connected later in the decade. Offshore wind's appeal lies in high-capacity factors and proximity to coastal demand centers, but development timelines are long, port infrastructure requires upgrades, and community acceptance must be actively managed. All of this expansion places enormous demands on the transmission system, a reality that Australia has begun addressing through a suite of grid-build programs. The centerpiece is Rewiring the Nation, a federal initiative providing concessional finance to accelerate priority transmission projects identified in EMO's Integrated System Plan, ISP. The 2024 ISP outlines thousands of kilometers of new high-voltage lines to connect renewable energy zones, strengthen interstate links, and unlock storage sites. Complementing this, the Capacity Investment Scheme, CIS, offers long-term revenue underwriting to de-risk investment in large-scale renewables and dispatchable capacity, such as batteries and pumped hydro. Together, these policies aim to align capital flows, approvals, and system needs so the NEM can reach the government's goal of about 82% renewable electricity by 2030. Whether that target is reached on time remains contested, but the institutional architecture to pursue it is falling into place. Australia's exceptional status in uranium deserves special mention, because it often sparks confusion about nuclear power at home. Australia holds the world's largest known uranium resources, and is consistently among the top mine producers, exporting all output to countries with safeguards agreements. Yet Australia has no nuclear power plants, and at the federal level, maintains legislative prohibitions on nuclear electricity generation and fuel cycle facilities. The country does operate a research reactor at Lucas Heights that supports nuclear medicine, but political, economic, and policy considerations have kept commercial nuclear off the grid. Periodic debates arise, especially as nations reassess nuclear's role in net zero strategies, but any shift would require legal changes, long lead times, and substantial public and private investment. In the meantime, Australia's nuclear contribution is indirect, supplying uranium to allied reactors abroad while pursuing a renewables plus storage pathway at home. Regional diversity within Australia deeply influences energy patterns. Western Australia's separate electricity system, the SWES, hosts large-scale renewables and batteries, but also depends on gas from local fields. The Northern Territory pursues its own mix with abundant solar resources, and the East Coast NEM spans Queensland to Tasmania with very different resource endowments and load profiles. South Australia has emerged as a global exemplar of high renewable penetration, regularly operating with a majority of demand met by wind and solar, often exporting surplus to neighbours. Victoria and New South Wales are advancing onshore and offshore wind zones while planning for the retirement of major coal stations. Queensland, historically coal-centric, is now rolling out large solar, wind, and storage alongside a long-term hydrogen export strategy. Tasmania leverages deep hydro resources and interconnection. On the demand side, electrification and efficiency are reshaping Australia's energy outlook. As households adopt efficient electric appliances, rooftop solar, and progressively, batteries and electric vehicles, daytime grid demand patterns are changing. Midday duck curves are deepening as distributed solar output soars, which reduces emissions but also increases the need for flexible demand, storage, and smarter tariffs to absorb excess generation. Industrial users, particularly in mining and minerals processing, are increasingly contracting for renewable power or building behind-the-meter assets to manage price risk and decarbonize production, reinforcing the link between Australia's resources sector and its clean energy transition. Meanwhile, the transport sector remains dominated by liquid fuels, keeping oil products central to final energy use, even as the electricity grid greens. Hydrogen is emerging as a long-range bet rather than a short-term pillar of supply. Pilot projects aim to produce green hydrogen from wind and solar for domestic use and potential export as ammonia, leveraging Australia's land, sun, and wind. Yet hydrogen remains capital-intensive, and its near-term role in bulk electricity generation is limited compared with batteries and pumped hydro. Policymakers view hydrogen as a tool for decarbonizing hard-to-electrify sectors, and for creating new export industries, with timelines stretching into the 2030s. The economics of generation technologies are shifting in Australia's favor for renewables, yet the practical work of connecting projects remains formidable. Utility-scale solar costs have continued trending downward, and the cost of battery storage has fallen sharply, making batteries a linchpin of the CIS tenders. Still, wind projects have faced rising capital costs, supply chain bottlenecks, and slower construction starts in recent periods, prompting concerns about meeting 2030 targets without accelerated approvals, better social license processes, and stronger transmission delivery. No account of Australia's energy profile is complete without discussing the social and environmental dimensions of coal and gas. Export earnings from these commodities support jobs, regional development and fiscal revenues, and trading relationships, especially with Japan, South Korea, and China, are geopolitically significant. At the same time, domestic policy seeks to cut power sector emissions in line with national climate targets, reduce local air pollution, and manage land and water impacts of resource development. The result is a nuanced policy balance, sustaining export competitiveness while decarbonizing the grid, safeguarding energy security while accelerating clean infrastructure, and aligning state and federal objectives amid varied local priorities. Looking specifically at electricity, the architecture of the NEM is transitioning from a centralized thermal system to a highly distributed, weather-driven system buffered by storage. In practice, that means more batteries, both grid-scale and behind-the-meter, more pumped hydro capacity, and more flexible loads such as controlled EV charging and electrified heating that can be shifted in time. It also means new interconnectors and high-capacity lines to move energy from renewable energy zones to cities and industry. The ISP's blueprint envisions about 4,500 kilometers of new transmission by 2030, with further build-out through mid-century. The absence of domestic nuclear power raises recurring questions about whether Australia should reconsider its prohibitions, especially amid reliability debates and transmission delays. Proponents point to abundant uranium, existing nuclear expertise in medicine and research, and the potential for small modular reactors to repurpose retiring coal sites. Opponents emphasize cost, lead times, waste management, and the opportunity cost compared with rapidly deployable renewables and storage. For now, the legal bans remain in force, and the federal government's strategy is anchored in reaching an 82% renewable electricity share with dispatchable storage and strengthened grids. Australia's energy trade balance highlights a final paradox. It is one of the world's largest exporters of coal and LNG, yet it imports most of its refined petroleum. That reflects refinery closures over the past decade and the economics of scale in Asian refining hubs. It also explains why international fuel markets and shipping logistics exert outsized influence on domestic transport costs and inflation. The government has responded with policies to bolster minimum fuel holdings, co-fund refinery upgrades for cleaner fuel standards, and integrate Australia's emergency stocks with allies. Even so, the shift to electric mobility and sustainable aviation fuels will gradually change this calculus, reducing exposure to imported diesel and petrol over time as EV adoption grows and public charging expands. The path forward is therefore as much about coordination as it is about construction. Meeting high renewable shares requires synchronizing generation, storage, and transmission delivery, aligning state-level renewable energy zones with national planning, and streamlining approvals without losing environmental and community safeguards. It also depends on workforce development, domestic manufacturing of key components where viable and pragmatic sequencing of coal retirements with replacement capacity. Policy tools such as the Capacity Investment Scheme provide revenue certainty to crowd in private capital, while rewiring the nation targets the long lead backbone of the system. In the medium term, Australia's comparative advantages are likely to persist even as its energy mix changes. Ultimately, the Australian energy landscape is defined by motion. Coal plants retiring, solar rooftops proliferating, batteries multiplying, and new lines marching across the map. If it succeeds, Australia can remain an energy superpower in a decarbonizing world. Not because of what it digs up alone, but because of what it builds on top of its natural endowments. A modern grid, a flexible market, and an export portfolio that evolves with global demand.